We often forget that our faith is actually rooted in the oral storytelling tradition. When people gathered together, it was not to hear a three-point sermon, it was to hear stories of how God showed up in their ancestors' lives. As our Lenten series will be following Peter's journey with Jesus, today's sermon will be a story. It'll be a story from his life that I've put together using accounts from all four Gospels, little biblical research, and also some creative license. So I invite you to listen with a little bit of a different posture this week. And listen with this week's theme in mind. It's from our hymn, Jesus Sought Me When a Stranger, Wandering from the Fold of God. This hymn, as we do this theme, it's meant to follow Peter's journey with Jesus. So ponder, how does Peter's journey with Jesus begin, and how do his interactions evolve? And also consider the ways that your own journey with Jesus resonates with Peter's story. Now, let us meet Simon Peter. Simon was a strong man, some might say stubborn. Raised by the Sea of Galilee, he and his brother Andrew spent their childhoods playing and fighting as siblings do. Confident as a youth and sometimes rash, the other village boys naturally gravitated towards Simon, following his lead both into games and into mischief. Andrew's temperament was meeker. Following, the other boys would naturally sometimes tease him, but Simon, stronger, braver, and always loyal, was quick to defend his brother, and no one dared to cross him. As the brothers grew older, they remained close, but their interests began to diverge. Andrew took after their mother, quieter, a little more sensitive to those around him, and he listened eagerly to the stories of their Jewish ancestors and asked many questions about the temple in Jerusalem. Simon, more inclined to action, followed the men of the village down by the lake. Soon he began helping his father and uncles work the fishing boats, soaking up the attention and praise that the fishermen would comment on how strong he was for his age. He quickly took to the craft, and his hands grew thick with calluses from spending long nights manning the nets in the water. As time went on and the brothers grew older, they began spending less time together. Andrew's religious devotion meant he was often at the synagogue, listening to the teachings of the local rabbi. Despite his limited education, he was reading a bit of the prophetic scrolls for himself. Simon, never understanding his brother's fascination with ancient texts, preferred to shoot the breeze with the other fishermen, swapping stories about their ventures at sea. But the brothers remained devoted to each other, even if their days looked quite different. When their parents decided that it was time for Simon to get married and take over the family business, it was Andrew's suggestion of a certain young maiden who ultimately became Simon's wife. He helped with building a home and getting the new couple settled. He was often reminding Simon to observe the Jewish festivals and get to temple more often. Though he loved his brother, Simon, for the most part, did not care to spend much time on religious matters and instead focused his energy on running the family business. Years passed and his reputation and success grew, allowing him to buy more boats, bringing on more workers. Villagers would tell the time that Simon dived into the freezing lake to rescue a man who had fallen overboard, or about his amazing ability to sense where the fish were and bring in a large haul when others would come back empty. Simon became known as one of the leading fishermen, not just in his own village, but also among neighboring villages on the lake. Meanwhile, Andrew began talking about strange things. In fact, Simon was growing concerned about his brother. There had been chatter in the village about a man in the desert who ate wild locusts and shouted dire warnings to repent at anyone who would come near. At first, Simon scoffed, made disparaging comments about the crazy bug man, who was out in the wilderness. He disdained people who did not work to provide for their families. But then he discovered Andrew had been going out to see the man. Over dinner one evening, Simon confronted him, and to his dismay, Andrew revealed that he had been baptized by the man. The brothers exchanged heated words that ended only when Simon stormed out of the house in frustration. Months went by, and Andrew's devotion to the bug man, called John the Baptist, only grew more intense. At best, Simon would manage to bite his tongue while Andrew went on and on about the prophecies. His resentment grew, though, as his brother spent time in the desert instead of helping with the family business, especially because Simon's luck seemed to have turned. Lately, he was barely getting enough fish to keep his boats running, and he was worried he might need to let some of his workers go. With less fish caught, and therefore less to be sold, Simon's days grew longer. Then one morning, while he was cleaning the boats, Andrew came to him out of breath and insistently proclaiming, the one the prophets been talking about, the Messiah. I think I found him. He was so agitated the other fishermen were staring at him, empty fishing nets hanging from their hands. Unable to calm Andrew down, Simon finally agreed to go meet this man, more out of concern for his brother. Tired, irritated, and feeling a bit belligerent, Simon was working up some choice words as Andrew had interrupted his workday, leaving the boats unprepared for the next shift. Who was this man that had made his brother so unreasonable? What kind of person spent all their time in the wilderness doing God knows what instead of providing for their families? First, it was the bug man called John the Baptist. Now his brother was rambling on about the Messiah. Simon was ready to straighten out not just his brother, but anyone else who got in his way. He saw a small crowd in the distance, huddled around a figure who was teaching all of them. As they drew closer, Simon cleared his throat, ready to confront this so-called Messiah. But with each step he took, Simon grew more unsure. There was an unfamiliar feeling rising in his body, and his certainty of a moment ago started to slip away. All his life he'd been a bold person, but suddenly he found himself at a loss for words. He stopped just short of the group and stared at the teacher, Andrew, standing beside him. And then the so-called Messiah turned and looked directly at him in a way that Simon had never been looked at before. You are Simon, son of Jonah. You are to be called Peter. Their eyes locked, and then the moment passed. The teacher went on addressing the crowd. Andrew was saying something excitedly to him, but he did not really hear anything. He felt confused, still a little belligerent, but not sure of what just had happened. It was like the teacher had seen a part of him that even he was unaware of. Yet how could that be? Without uttering a single word, Simon turned around and left, trying to shake off the encounter. Back at the lake, he threw himself into the work of preparing the boats for the evening shift. A couple of weeks passed with ongoing business struggles while Andrew now spent almost all of his time with the so-called Messiah. Privately, Simon had told his wife about the encounter, of how the teacher had somehow known his name, his father's name, and then strangely called him by a new name, Peter, which means rock. Neither of them really knew what to make of it. So Simon tried to forget about it and to focus on saving family business. It was what he knew and who he was, a fisherman. One morning, though, his wife came to him, anxious about her mother who had been living with them since her husband died. She had not been well the past few days, despite the medicine Simon had traded for his meager catch at the market. He quickly left his partners to finish cleaning the boats and hurried back to the house with his wife. His mother-in-law was lying in bed, flushed and moaning, barely conscious and breathing. Unsure of what else to do, he began pacing back and forth. Clearly the medicine had not worked, and she seemed to be getting worse with each passing minute. Out of desperation, Simon began reciting some of the scriptures. He struggled to remember them, wishing that Andrew was there. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His wife started crying as one of the servant girls left the house. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." Simon's mother-in-law quieted a bit, so he searched for the rest of the words. "He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake." Simon did not notice the growing murmur approaching his house, as the familiar psalm became his prayer. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me." And at that moment, the teacher was beside him, stretching his hand out over his mother-in-law and uttering things that Simon could not comprehend. He watched, as if in a dream, his mother-in-law rise from the bed and thank the teacher with a kiss on each cheek. And then there was noise all around him from the crowd pressing to get closer into Simon's house. As if from nowhere, there appeared many sick villagers seeking the teacher's healing. Again, Simon was at a loss for words and simply sat down and watched the unfolding drama. At some point, Andrew was there, speaking to his wife and mother-in-law, and as people came and went, his house, the center of miraculous activity, Peter just sat. Then the teacher was moving, heading out the door, and Simon realized that hours had passed, and it was now dawn. He roused himself from his trance, wondering for a second time what had just happened. As the days passed, word of teachers' healings spread, and many people from all over Galilee came over to their village. Strangers would stand outside his house, pointing excitedly and talking about miracles. He no longer felt belligerent, but Simon was unsure of what to think. Twice now the teacher had crossed his path, and both times Simon was left feeling more uncertain about himself, something that he was not used to. He threw himself into work because it was the one thing he did know, how to be a fisherman. The teacher remained in their village, and the crowds grew larger. Simon ignored them, and went about his usual routine, fishing at night, trading during the day. Business still was not great, and several evenings a week the boats would come back almost empty, which only grew his resolve to work harder. Then one morning, after a particularly long and unsuccessful night, Simon caught sight of the crowds heading towards the lake, and looking around, he saw that the teacher was standing near him and the boats. Realizing the crowds were heading straight towards the teacher, he quickened his cleaning so that he could make his getaway. As he finished rolling up the nets in his boat, he stepped onto the shore so he could quickly push off before all the people arrived. Before he could depart, though, the teacher walked over and stepped into his boat, asking him to put out from shore a little ways. Looking at the approaching crowd and his now occupied boat, Simon made the quick decision that he could not leave his boat, the source of his whole livelihood, and for that matter, his whole identity, with this strange man. He pushed off and scrambled into the boat as the crowd hurried towards them. But now, Simon was stuck, wondering when he could offload his unwanted passenger and reclaim his boat. Finally, the crowd seemed ready to leave, satisfied by the teaching or maybe bored by the lack of miracles. And when there were just a few people left, Simon prepared the boat to head back to shore. But the teacher interrupted him, saying, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon was irritated. It was nearly noon. The sun was blazing. Even people who did not fish knew you did not go during the day, since the light made the nets visible to the fish. He was exhausted after being out all night and trapped all morning in the boat with the teacher. Figuring he would prove him wrong, Simon gritted a response through his teeth. "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." After dropping the nets into the water, they quickly began to tug and pull. Surprised, Simon yanked on them to see what they were caught on, and he quickly realized that there were fish in them, many fish. Straining to haul them on board, the nets began to tear. He could not believe what was happening. His whole life he had prided himself on his fishing expertise, yet here was this strange man with his nonsensical instructions directing him to the biggest catch of his life. The teacher sat there calmly, watching him pull in fish after fish after fish, and then Andrew's words began to sound in Simon's head. The one the prophets have spoken about, the Messiah. I think I found him. Simon signaled for his partners to come with the other boat to help. Several minutes later, the net showed no signs of being emptied of the fish as they continued to pour onto the boats. The other men, at first elated with their bounty, soon grew quiet as they kept pulling fish after fish out of the net. The uncertainty in Simon began to turn into fear as his boat became heavier and heavier with the load. All his life and all he had strived to be as a fisherman suddenly seemed oppressive with the mounting catch growing around him. Then his boat began to sink and fill with water, so massive was the burden of fish. Simon snapped out of his reverie and saw the teacher still sitting calmly and watching him. He suddenly felt like that rock Peter, the teacher, had named him, a sinking rock, as his whole identity was submerging him into the lake. He stumbled across the piles of fish and fell down at the teacher's knees. He did not know what he wanted anymore, but he knew that the teacher had incredible and terrifying power. Feeling crushed by the weight of the fish in his boat, he cried out to him, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Burden began to lift, with the water subsiding back into the lake and the boats stabilizing. As his breathing slowed and vision cleared, he looked all around him. There were hundreds and hundreds of fish just lying there. The teacher stood up, reached out his hand, and gave it to Simon Peter, saying, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." Simon Peter took his hand and found himself off his knees, facing the teacher. The boats were moving toward shore, filled with the miraculous catch of fish. With each stroke of the oar, Simon Peter knew that a crossroads in his life was approaching. As soon as the men docked the boats, the teacher stepped off and started walking away. Simon Peter looked at the boats in the lake, filled with his fish, and then at the figure growing more distant. Still a bit afraid and uncertain, Simon Peter nonetheless found his feet, trailing after the direction of the teacher. All he knew lay back with the boats and fish, but the teacher's invitation called out to him. What did he mean that he would catch people? Where was he taking him? With the growing sense the teacher held his destiny, Peter felt sure he had to go, that his life's meaning and purpose was wrapped up with this man. As he hurried his pace to catch up, he realized his partners were a little ways behind him. Grateful for the company, Peter waited a moment so that he was no longer journeying alone. Then together, they left everything